nation known for their dominant profile along the northeastern regions of North America. Comprised of 5 tribes, the Iroquois had the strength of united forces and the discipline of a well-structured government. But during the contact era, and after the settlement of European colonists, how successful were they in maintaining their autonomy? To answer this question, we analyze the effects of 3 key factors: the internal structure of their confederacy, the geography of the surrounding land, and finally, the interaction with the settlers themselves.
The Iroquois Confederacy first came into major contact with Europeans in 1609. At this time, most of the tribes were living in semi-sedentary villages. Due to this, the unique diseases that were brought over by the Europeans caused disease to spread rapidly throughout the Mohawk and Seneca tribes, because they had the most contacts with settlers. However, all the tribes were affected and there was a significant amount of death in every tribe. This depopulation had both negative and positive effects on the Iroquois Confederacy.
The Iroquois was composed of several differential tribes all in one union, a union that had been created in pressure of shared land and fear of dispute. The area that housed the 6 original colonies was referred to as the Eastern Woodlands and stretched around the shores of the Great Lakes. The Iroquois lived no more than 500 miles from the Cherokee Nation, in very close proximity to the Catskill, Allegheny, and Adirondack Mountains. Between the 17th and 18th century, the Iroquois were at their peak territory possession, with land stretching roughly 1,000 miles from Quebec to Kentucky, as well as Pennsylvania to Illinois, which allowed them to boast the largest native population at this time. For a long time, the Iroquois went without encountering Europeans because of their isolation from other tribes and the rough terrain that they resided in.
After the initial contact, more and more settlers streamed into America, and soon the Iroquois Confederacy was located between the Dutch, French, and British. Due to their central location, much interaction between them occurred. This caused for the Iroquois Confederacy to play a large part in the European rivalry for the control of North America. The Iroquois nation soon became aligned with British and Dutch, and regular interaction with trade occurred between them. However, during the 1600s, the French launched military campaigns against the Mohawk tribe. This not only caused bad blood between the French and Iroquois Confederacy, but caused a bitter rivalry and hatred between the two powers.
The structure of the Iroquois government was perhaps the most unique thing about their nation as a whole. The format of the Confederacy was based on a system of 5 groups, one for each tribe of the Confederacy. The 5 tribes instituted an intricate and elaborate political system. This included a 2-house legislature, similar to the British Parliament or the modern U.S. Congress. The representatives from the Seneca and Mohawk tribes met in one house, and those of the Oneida and Cayuga met in another. The Onondaga representatives acted as tiebreakers, and had the power to veto decisions made by the other tribes. Surprisingly, there was a strict verbal constitution that described these proceedings, but the protocols themselves were never written down. This organized and consistent government served an important purpose: to help stop the constant warfare between tribes and unify the different factions into a solidified nation. Before the unification of the tribes, their strength was crippled as they fought one another for land or resources. Stopping the internal conflict saved resources and time, allowing the nation to grow and stand together as one. This strength of a unified government allowed the Iroquois to completely retain their autonomy for hundreds of years during the early contact era, due to their willingness to communicate effectively and consistently with the settlers. Europeans recognized the size and strength of the Iroquois, and found it much harder to manipulate and bully them than they had with the other smaller tribes. Ultimately, however, their strength was so dependent on the unity of their government that when there was a split within the nation, a division of interest, the Confederation could not recover.
Western industrialization gave emergence to railways, advancement of weapons, and a variety of resources that made the harvest of agriculture much simpler. This was unfortunate for the Iroquois, whose fertile land became the interest of American farmers and colonists. The tribe was commanded to leave the land immediately for relocation to a small reservation in American territory. Many Iroquois did so with little resistance. Half of the population, perhaps under the interpretation that peace was a higher priority, The other half of the Confederacy, led by the Mohawk leader Joseph Grant, made a rebellious decision to travel into current Canada in search of land where they could redevelop as a group. This eventually gave way to an invasion by the Americans, who scattered the fleeing population.
During the American Revolution, the Iroquois tried to stay neutral, but with increased pressure to join one side or the other, the Tuscarora and Oneida sided with the colonists, while the Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga remained loyal to Great Britain, with whom they had deeper relationships. This was the first significant split within the nation, and it quickly set them against one another in the war. This was extremely destabilizing for the Iroquois, and it ultimately cost them their autonomy.
The question of autonomy is a very big one, for it goes both ways. In some aspects, they retained it, and others they lost it. In the beginning, they began to lose their autonomy in certain aspects as they began to converge to the culture of the settlers, and even welcome the trade, and especially for weapons. They became dependent on these weapons and eventually became the playthings of Europeans. But they would soon refrain from violent external affairs. This helped them retain their autonomy. Then, with the coming of revolution, they began losing their autonomy once again, as they became divided and supported both sides of the war. This caused them to be dependent on not only the British, but also the Americans. Then, at the end of the war, they were utterly decimated, and it seemed they had no unity or autonomy at all. They were relying on the products of the Europeans and settlers, and more or less ceased to be a nation.